Behind the ramparts, they tend to the wounded. While the commanders consider their options. They realize their losses are worse than they thought. 8 cohorts have been wiped out. The choices are poor. Maybe they should make a break for it. But marching on could be suicide. Varus must decide. Betrayed by the man he trusted most. His commanders urge him to stay behind their defenses. Messengers can be sent to the Halten and Xanten garrisons for reinforcements. There's no alternative. They need help. Varus rejects their advice. They can wipe out the barbarians once they leave the forest. He instructs his commanders to abandon the civilians and destroy the baggage train. Nothing must slow them down. The legions will march on at daybreak. The orders are clear and will be obeyed without question. It is a serious strategic error. The Germanic forces immediately spot the burning baggage train. A scout reports to Arminius. The Romans have ejected the civilians from the camp and are destroying their supplies. Some of the chieftains want to pillage before everything is burned. They know they owe their men booty. This is their chance. Arminius is furious. They could lose everything they've achieved so far. The tribes have sworn to obey him. He promises to lead them to victory if they obey his orders. The next morning, the legions leave the camp in battle order. Varus abandons the civilians to their fate. Perhaps he expects the barbarians to massacre them and plunder the supplies, and let his legions go free. But according to Tacitus, Arminius said that war is fought only against soldiers. On the third day, the weather turns. Torrential rain brings the legion's forced march to a halt. Their armor, now soaking wet and heavy as lead, makes the soldiers even less mobile than before. For Arminius and his men, this is perfectly normal weather. Cassius Dio writes, heavy storms broke out. While the Romans fought the elements, the barbarians moved into position, surrounding them on all sides. Arminius now unleashes an attack of appalling brutality. To the Romans, they must seem like evil spirits. There's no time for a heroic rearguard action. No time to look after the wounded. One chronicler wrote, "Caught in the bogs and the forests, the Romans were butchered man by man, by the same enemy they had butchered like cattle so many times before." And finally, in the chaos, Varus loses control of his legions. There are no generals left for the soldiers to follow. His army falls apart. In the space of 24 hours, Varus has faced 2 overwhelming attacks on his legions. He must have come to realize that victory is now beyond his grasp. He can only hope to avoid annihilation. One of his cavalry commanders finally reaches the scene of the massacre. He finds Varus at his wit's end. With no idea what to do. This could be the last chance to call for reinforcements. Numonius volunteers to break out with his cavalry to the nearest Roman stronghold before the horses are too exhausted to move. According to Roman historians, Numonius only wanted to save his own skin. He left the foot soldiers in the lurch and fled towards the Rhine. But fate took its revenge. As Paterculus recorded, death overtook the traitor on the way. Whatever Varus and Numonius may have planned, Arminius is a step ahead. Another trap awaits the fleeing cavalry. Not a single horseman will make it to the Rhine. Now the legionaries waste no time to get moving. Nothing matters but getting out of the forest. The tribesmen are always just behind them. They know they only have to drive the Romans forwards. And the legions stumble blindly on. But the night's forced march has done the trick. At last, 3 days after the Romans left their regular route, the forest gets lighter, the land gets flatter. At last, there's a glimmer of hope. The Romans are safe. Open country. If Varus had been counting on Numonius's cavalry, he realizes now that all hope is lost. And Arminius makes sure the Romans understand. They're still in the trap. When the Romans emerge from the forest and form up in the open, Arminius gathers his men for the final battle. The legions have nothing to counter the tribe's cry of freedom or death. Now they scent victory. More and more tribesmen are going over to Arminius. Even Roman allies like Segestes. Through opportunism, not conviction. The battle is a victory over the Romans that no one would have thought possible. Close to 15,000 soldiers lie dead in the forest. The few survivors drag themselves across the plain, waiting to be captured and slaughtered. There could be no greater humiliation for the superpower that is Rome. Arminius' victory is unprecedented. Of the Roman historians, it was Tacitus who really understood its significance. Arminius was indisputably the liberator of Germania. Varus would become the scapegoat for the greatest military disaster Rome had ever experienced. He commits suicide on the battlefield. As Paterculus disdainfully comments, this commander had more courage to die than to fight. In the end, he ran himself through. Even after 3 days of fighting, the bloodshed is not at an end. The victorious tribesmen pass over the battlefield, ripping armor and weapons from the bodies of the dead and dying. They sacrifice captured legionaries to the gods that granted them victory. The standards of the legions are stamped into the mud, and Varus's corpse is defiled. His head goes on a terrible journey to the Emperor Augustus in Rome. If the tribes stay loyal, Arminius can build on his triumph. In his hour of victory, he is the undisputed leader of the Germanic tribes. But will the Romans seek revenge? 6 years later, in 15 AD, Roman legions return to the site of the disaster. Tacitus describes the terrible discoveries made by the legions under the command of Germanicus. Bleached bones were lying all over the forest floor. Skulls were nailed to trees. These were the barbarians' altars, on which they slaughtered the tribunes and centurions. Almost 2,000 years later, archaeologists in Calcrisa discover bones buried in a mass grave. They're all the bones of men. They show signs of violence. They were exposed to the elements for a long time before being buried. Could this be proof that Calcrisa was the site of the battle? Perhaps the archaeologists have confirmed the truth of Tacitus' account 2,000 years later. But not everyone is satisfied, and the search for the battlefield goes on. Germanicus failed in his attempt to take revenge, to crush the Germanic tribes. Arminius fought more battles against the Romans and kept them at bay. Germanicus was ordered back to Rome. The superpower withdrew to the Rhine. Germania would never become a Roman province. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was one of the most significant of the ancient world. It resulted in a fundamental and long-lasting cultural divide that split Europe in two. Arminius paid for his ambition of creating a Germanic kingdom with his life. He was poisoned, probably by his own family. Without a common enemy, the land fell back into a state of permanent feuding. No chieftain could tolerate another exceeding him in power and influence, a situation that would characterize this part of Europe until modern times.